for you personally, like what does Orlando mean for you?
Look, Orlando is one of those brands and one of those names that really just resonates if you've been, interested in wine for, decades, and that might be me. But, it's the name that has sort of been across the Great Arch at Tanunda. It's, as you enter the township, it's, I just was only just a couple of days ago down in Victor Harbour, and there's this, on one of the old buildings down there, there's this fantastic old sort of, sign. It must be sort of 2 stories high almost, this building, and it's about half of the height. And so, it's just one of those names that everywhere you go, it's part of your zeitgeist in terms of wine culture, and certainly, from the Barossa Valley and from the history of South Australian wine. And of course, I was also, I remember as a young fella, we had Barossa Pearl, the great old Barossa Pearl in our house, usually on Sunday for Sunday lunch. I recall that probably being part of the thing that we had. I was brought up on Barossa Sect as a house sparkling, and I guess in the 50s and 60s, Barossa Pearl was an extension of that. I think every household who drank wine, had Barossa Pearl in their house, and so it's just one of those things that is part of the way we live. And I think also because of those great old sort of brands from, or the names of those labels and the names of those wines from the Coonawarra and from Pathaway, they stretch your horizons in terms of some of the great and well-regarded regions. They've been there the whole time, and they're the ones we tasted, and they're the ones we learned about. So it's been a really important, name for us and wine to drink over decades and decades.
And if you were to pick out like a favourite, an Orlando wine that has the greatest resonance for you, would it be Barossa Pearl?
Well, it would be. Well, in terms of my memory bank, it would be Barossa Pearl. But I think in terms of my my palate bank, it would be Steingarten for one, and also Jacaranda Ridge Cabernet the other. So if you wanted to sort of have the two ends of the spectrum in terms of the Orlando wines over the years, they would be the ones that have that I recall and have loved, more than anything.
Lovely. And Jeni, for you, what has Orlando meant for you personally?
Personally, I think it's the reason why I'm here in front of you. It's Barossa Pearl. It's the wine that I tasted very young, and it's the wine that resonated the most. And it's what I loved about wine, and why eventually I became a wine writer. It's probably not a story that Wine Australia would like to hear, but as a 9-year-old, I would stay with my aunt, who had no children, I might add, had no idea how to raise children, but every now and again I would, I don't know, once a month, twice a month, I'd have a weekend with her, and she would open Barossa Pearl, and I would share a fair amount of it, is my memory. And I just love that taste. It was grapes. It was just fresh and clean and grapey. And for a 9-year-old, that was pretty damn exciting, I've got to say.
But also it's a vital wine that's clearly got a lot of people into wine, isn't it? Like it really is a vital moment in Australian wine in some ways.
Well, in fact, I was looking up a little bit of history, and Gunter Pruss, who was the managing director for a very long time, very famous wine name in Australian wine history, said that, and it was launched during the Melbourne Olympics too. It was made to celebrate with all the visitors coming over to Melbourne for the 56 Olympics. And he said that, to his memory, it did more than any other table wine to establish wine as an integral part of our society. And I think he was right. And he gave up counting after 10 million bottles. They reached 10 million bottles so quickly that they simply gave up counting, because 1 million bottles was happening like that all the time. And it lasted about 3 decades. So it was very, very important, not just for me, But for so many drinkers of my generation, Tony's generation, set us on the path to being a wine drinking nation, moving away from beer.
I was just about to say that, Jenny. I mean, it was right at that cusp. It was the transition from long neck bottles of beer at the dinner table, in our family certainly, and certainly probably amongst people that we knew, into a long neck bottle of sparkling wine, and that then, probably established the bridgehead into wine culture rather than beer culture. So it really, I mean, probably if you culturally looked at it in that way, it was incredibly important. And
because the 50s are also when you get the post-World War II immigration into Australia. You're getting the Greeks and the Italians, and they are changing the way we are eating and drinking. It happened in a very synergistic way, I think, all around the same time.
And just as a little sidelight, I found in my kitchen a couple of weeks ago, or a month or so ago, was just sitting in the back of in a corner, was this wine. Now, I know it's probably looking backwards to you. It's Star Wine, Sparkling Star Wine Orlando. And Ben and I did a bit of a
Can you put it closer? Because we can't quite see, Tony. Can you put it right up against the camera?
Right up. Okay, so you've got this amazing, beautiful label, which is the reason we kept it, was this label. This beautiful starlit sky, little Barossa village, church steeples, etc., that sort of thing. And Ben did a little bit of a research on that. We were talking about it, and so Colin Gramp was saying that this was a step up in level and quality from Barossa Pearl. So a couple of years after Barossa Pearl of '56, this Star Wine came on to they started making Star Wine in '58, and they had to introduce some new technology. Ben, I think you were looking at that, weren't you?
I just found an interview just serendipitously with Colin that was in the library archives. And he was just trying to create a wine that was that stepping stone for people that had been drinking Pearl for a while, but wanted to move up a little bit. So that's why they introduced Star Wine.
And so I think the technology...
Dry style, was it?
Well, I'm not entirely. I think it was still sweet, but obviously I haven't tried it, so it's hard for me to gauge. But I believe it should have been a bit drier. I suspect it was slightly higher quality fruit, but yeah.
And I think the thing was that the technology that they developed to make this next level up kind of was an inspiration for the technology that then they went into making Riesling. They learned about the cooling aspects in the winery. So I think so it was only 4 years after they started making Star Wine that they planted the Steingarten vineyard, and they started being serious about making super crisp, beautiful, clean Riesling, which was a real the next breakthrough, I think, in that history and in the wine culture from Orlando.
So talking about Steingarten, I mean, Shanteh and I are from slightly different generations, I guess. Orlando means a little bit different to us, I would suggest. Not that we didn't drink sweet wine, but I mean, Shanteh, for you personally, and not in and out of the restaurant scene, how do you see, things like Jacaranda Ridge and Steingarten? How do they, for your customers, how do they see it?
It's interesting. I actually spoke to my parents and actually my in-laws, and I'd come across Steingarten a couple of times throughout my career and seen it on a few kind of wine lists where they had a bit of vintage depth. So Steingarten for me was something that I had some attachment to, but I was very pleasantly surprised by chatting to quite a few people just how much the Orlando name just rolled off their tongue, and they were like, oh gosh, that brings me back. So much attachment to it, and re-experiencing these wines, I really get a sense of an Aussie spirit about them, and Jacaranda Ridge in particular reminds me of some of the wines that I first fell in love with when I was getting into wine, and then I was tasting out of my father's cellar. So I think they've done an amazing job of really encapsulating what the spirit of Orlando is all about, but also moving forward with their New Heroes range is very impressive.
I think for me personally, I think Steingarten, you could never find it. It was the only problem with Steingarten, because obviously for a long time it was the single vineyard wine. Maybe it all went to South Australia and Melbourne, but literally you could not, and I wasn't going to many posh restaurants, but you literally could not find it. It was so incredibly hard to find, and so finding a bottle of Steingarten sitting in the back of a wine shop was a bit of it was like you'd found hidden treasure. And often they had a couple of years on them. And Shanteh, I think the same, my experience mirrors yours in some ways, is I had heard a lot about them, and they did live up to their expectations that I have of them as well. And Jacaranda Ridge as well, I think that as well, it's a classic Coonawarra style, but it's done, I think, very, very well. So in terms of those legendary wines, we've all tasted some of those wines, recently. I mean, Ben, when you've got your hands on these golden oldies, so to speak, I mean, how do you feel about that? Is that, do you feel like you're carrying a legacy?
Absolutely, there's a bit of pressure there as well, because I mean, it's a very much loved brand, not only through Australia and South Australia, but in the Barossa. That name's been around since the Grant family's obviously been around since 1847 when they planted their first vines there, and has established that long tradition of employing locals and the likes. There's a great love for the brand, and obviously we want to do well by the brand and take it into the future and really look after it and nurture it. So there's a bit of pressure there, but it's also a great challenge and super exciting to be involved and help it evolve a little bit to stay modern to a degree, but still paying respect to the past.